Space, the final frontier. This is the Observer's Notebook, the official podcast of the Association of Lunar and Planetary Observers. Its mission to explore the solar system, to seek out new observations and data, to boldly go where no podcast has gone before. And now the host of the Observer's Notebook, Tim Robertson.
Hello and welcome to episode 202 of the Observer's Notebook, the official podcast of the Association of Lunar and Planetary Observers. I'm Tim Robertson, the host of the Observer's Notebook and also the coordinator of the training program within the ALPO. Thanks for downloading and listening. The ALPO collects and analyzes observations of various solar system bodies and associated phenomenon, and publishes detailed reports concerning these bodies in its quarterly publication, the Journal of the Association of Lunar and Planetary Observers. This podcast depends upon donations from you, our listeners, to keep it going. If you enjoy what you hear on the podcast, you can donate to it via Patreon. You can start off by giving as little as $1 a month. If you feel even more generous, for $5, you receive early access to the podcast before it goes public. For a monthly donation of $10, you receive a copy of the Novice Observer's Handbook. And for $35 a month, you receive producer credits on the podcast. You can find out more by going to www.patreon.com/observersnotebook. And if you'd like to join the Association of Lunar and Planetary Observers, membership begins at only $22 a year. Find out more at www.alpo-astronomy.org. And we're also on Facebook. Just search for ALPO Astronomy. And yes, this podcast also has a Facebook page as well. Just search for Observer's Notebook. And if you enjoy what you hear in the podcast, please subscribe. That way you'll never miss another episode. And now episode 202. And it's our January 1st edition every single year, where we talk about comets with our comet expert, Carl Hergenrother. Let's see what's going to happen in 2025. Enjoy. All right, I'd like to welcome everybody back to this special edition of a New Year's podcast. And if it's New Year's Day, that means we're talking to Carl Hergenrother about comets for the coming year. Welcome back to the podcast, Carl.
Thanks for having me back, Tim.
Yeah. Now, you want to talk about previous year's comets before we get into this year's?
Sure, yeah.
All right.
2024 was quite an exciting year for comets.
It was great.
Yeah, it was great. It was kind of a weird year because we didn't actually have a lot of comets, but the ones we had were really special.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, we had two returning Halley-type comets. Halley-type comets are comets that are, have an orbital period between, say, 20 and 200 years.
Mm-hmm.
As we know, Halley comes around every 76 years. And there's a bunch of comets that come around with orbital periods about 70, 80 years. So they're comets you only really see maybe once a lifetime. Maybe if you're lucky and the timing's right, you might see them twice a lifetime. And this past year, we had two of them, 12P Pons Brooks
Mm-hmm.
and 13P Olbers, which return every 69 to 71 years.
Mm-hmm.
And they both came by. Olbers, not a very good return. In fact, I don't think it got much closer to the Earth than about, I think it was like 1.9 astronomical units, which is not particularly close, but it still brightened up to 6 magnitude. Was a nice evening object in the summer here in the Northern Hemisphere. And then, of course, Pons Brooks, which, again, not a particularly great return, but Pons Brooks is actually a pretty active bright comet in its own right.
Mm-hmm.
Got within about 1.55 AU of the Earth in early June. Reached perihelion in late April at 0.78 AU. And the interesting thing about Pons Brooks is it did something that it also had done during its last return back in the mid-1950s. It experienced a whole series of major outbursts. Now, we remember Holmes had the, big outburst, like 10 magnitudes.
Right.
And it did that back, about 20 odd years ago. It had done it back in the 1890s. There were a few other comets like Tettel-Giacobini-Krasik in the 70s, and it did it again a couple decades ago, had big outbursts. And then there's a lot of comets that have smaller outbursts. But Pons Brooks had about a half dozen or more 5 magnitude outbursts
Wow.
as it was coming in towards perihelion. And it had done this as well during its last return in the 1950s. So it seems for whatever reason, Pons Brooks is just very conducive to having these large outbursts, which was great. It gave you something to watch as it was coming in when the comet was still brightening. And then once it was bright and visible, and it actually peaked at around magnitude 4, so it was, borderline naked eye object. It developed a wonderful tail. It had dust jets. It had kind of everything you wanted to see in the comet. And it's just a shame that its orbit doesn't bring it just a little bit closer to the sun. And because this comet, if you were to place it, on the same orbit as Halley, if you were to place Pons Brooks and Halley right next to each other, Pons Brooks might actually be the brighter comet.
Wow.
So it's one of those where just because it's on a slightly worse orbit when it comes to viewing geometries and how close it gets to the sun, and how often it gets to a high phase angle and it gets dust enhancement due to forward scattering, little foreshadowing to 2 comets we're going to talk about later. It just doesn't have as good a return as Halley consistently seems to get. So yeah, we had those 2 really good Halley type comets that came around. We had a number of nice short period comets. 144P Koshida got up to 8th magnitude. That's a comet that was discovered relatively late in the game. Was discovered in the early 90s. A lot of the bright short period comets were discovered, 100 years ago, maybe even earlier. Koshida was discovered in the 90s. And that one consistently seems to get up to about 8th magnitude during good returns. And it did it again early in 2024. There was also 62P Shushinshan. That was a comet discovered in the 1960s at Shushinshan Observatory. And that one got up to magnitude 8. And of course, if Shushinshan sounds familiar, that's because probably the most interesting comet of 2024 happened to be one of the most recent Shushinshan discoveries, which was C2023A3 Shushinshan Atlas. And this was a long period comet discovered in January of 2023. So we're talking almost 2 years ago now. And this was a comet that at the time, probably when we were doing this comets of 2024, there's always some uncertainty for these long period comets as to, how bright is this thing going to get? Is it even going to survive perihelion? Is this its first time through the inner solar system?
Yeah, that was a big question with this one. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And at the time, that was a little bit unknown as to whether or not it was dynamically old, dynamically new. And when I say dynamically old, dynamically new, by dynamically old, I mean it has been around a few times before. By dynamically new, I mean it's making its first time through. And if it is making its first passage through the inner solar system, usually it's kind of abnormally bright as it's approaching the sun. Like think Kohoutek, think Austin. Comets that kind of disappoint you. They end up not being as bright as you hope they would be based on how bright they are initially. And in the case of some comets like Ison, they completely disintegrate and, a huge disappointment. And we're still not 100% sure whether Shushinshan Atlas is dynamically old or new. But as we all know, it survived perihelion.
Right.
It brightened really well. And it ended up becoming quite a nice object. One of the things it did do was it really threw us for a few loops. And not that the comet was acting weird, but kind of our assumptions that we make about predicting comets. You can say we oversimplified things. The comet was coming in, it was brightening nicely. And then sometime around mid-April, it got to opposition. Just like with the planets, opposition is when you're looking at Mars or Jupiter, that's when they're at their brightest. That's when they're opposite the sun. So the comet's basically at the point where it's almost directly opposite the sun. So it's at very low phase angle. So you can think of it as like fully illuminated. It's almost like full moon. You're seeing full comet. Now, most people don't really care about phase angle effects when it comes to comets because you're not really seeing the body of the comet. You're seeing the dust and the gas. And the gas doesn't have much in the way of phase angle effect. But the dust does have a little bit of a phase angle effect. And at some extreme phase angles, it can have an extreme effect. But what happened was it got to opposition. It had brightened to about magnitude 10, magnitude 9, magnitude 10. So people were starting to observe it, visually, backyard telescopes.
Mm-hmm.
And then it started fading. End of April through May, even into June, it got fainter and fainter. And that got everyone going, oh no, here we go. It's doing what ISON did. It was brightening nicely, and then all of a sudden it started fading. So this comet's breaking up. There were, in fact, a few papers that were published, or at least released. Nowadays, a lot of papers get released without going through peer review and the process, but they still get kind of quote unquote published, saying that, the comet's breaking up, it's disintegrating, this and that. And so there are all these calls for the comet, monitor the comet because this is it. This is the end of it. It's going to be a letdown. Well, it turns out what happened was the comet reached that very minimum phase angle. It got to basically that full moon, full comet position. And that's when the comet is when it's at that low phase angle, that full moon. Remember, the full moon's really bright at full moon. And part of that is because you're at really low phase angle, get a lot of backscattering, light that's reflected directly back at you. Comet dust does the same thing. So the comet got a little bit of a brightness boost as it went through opposition. And then as it moved away from opposition, the comet's still brightening. But because it was kind of going towards, say, gibbous phase, to our eyes, from our observing viewpoint, it appeared to fade. And then eventually, after a few months, it started brightening again. And that was just because, that fading kind of was overcome by the fact that the comet's really getting closer to the Earth, closer to the sun.
Right.
And the regular brightening trend took over. So what it really taught us is that you can't kind of chintz on the phase angle effects. You can do it for most comets, but for some comets, you do have to take that into account when you predict the brightness of some comets going forward. So in that comet in particular, had we simply modeled the phase angle effect correctly, we would have been able to predict that, it would have peaked in April, it would have faded for a few months, not for real, but just how it appeared to our eyes, and then it would start brightening again. But the nice thing is that phase angle effect also meant that when the comet was at perihelion, originally it was predicted only to reach about second magnitude, which is not overly impressive for a comet that's really, really close to the sun, and I mean within a few degrees of the sun. And even a week or two after perihelion, Julian Atlas was supposed to pass almost directly between the Earth and the sun, within about 3 degrees. And second magnitude, you're not going to see that. Definitely not going to see that visually, and you probably wouldn't even be able to image it, at least from the ground. The SOHO spacecraft would see it, but we wouldn't see it from the ground. But because
it was too close to the sun.
Exactly. It was too close to the sun, right. But because it was between the Earth and the sun, it was at a very high phase angle. And when you're in line with the sun, so now you're getting forward scattering, which means light is shining through the dust and then being scattered in a forward direction towards the observer. And if you've ever seen like a beam of light shining through a window, or for those of us who are old enough that remember overhead projectors or projectors of any kind, you'll always see pieces of dust that are kind of floating in the beam. And there are certain angles where you see a lot more dust than otherwise. And one of those angles is if you're kind of looking back up in the direction of the light itself. That's forward scattering of dust. And so comets that are between the Earth and the sun get this enhanced brightness because of this dust forward scattering.
Okay.
It is, in fact, this dust forward scattering that kind of makes Halley such a wonderful comet, because Halley's orbit, because it's perihelion, is around 0.5 AU. So it always passes between the Earth and the sun. It's in a retrograde orbit because it goes in the opposite direction as the Earth rotates. So almost every return, except of course for the one that us of a certain age all witnessed in 1986.
Right.
The comet passes between the Earth and the sun, so it always has 1 or 2 magnitudes of brightness enhancement. So that's why Halley kind of always ends up being brighter than it really should be and becomes a great comet. So Julian Atlas actually ended up experiencing about 4 to 5 magnitudes of brightness enhancement. So instead of it being a magnitude 2 comet, thanks to this dust enhancement, it probably peaked at around negative fourth magnitude when it was closest to the sun. And that was measured by the SOHO spacecraft. I know a lot of people imaged it from the ground when it was close to the sun. I didn't see many reports of people seeing it visually. And part of that might be because even though negative 4 sounds really bright, so we all know Venus is negative 4, though, to be honest, when Venus is at its brightest, like it is right now in the sky in the evening, it's really closer almost to negative 5. And of course, that's a Venus that's about 46 degrees from the sun, not 4 degrees from the sun. And that's Venus, that's more of a point source. And the comet is a couple of arc minutes across, so it's a little more diffuse. So it's a little more difficult to see. But yeah, and then after having passed between the Earth and the sun, it shot into the evening sky. It kind of did a rerun of what we saw with Comet Hergenrother, which was a nice comet that appeared in 1957, and also a very important comet to the ALPO Comets Section, because it was one of 2 great comets that appeared in 1957 that really kick-started and brought about the formation of the Comets Section in late 57, 58, Mercash and Hergenrother. And what was great is that just like Hergenrother, Shawn Atlas appeared, screamed into the evening sky, went through the orbit plane crossing at the same time. So we also had a dust trail that was an anti-tail that was going in the opposite direction towards the sun. Unlike Hergenrother, where that dust trail was naked eye feature, or a bright visual feature, I wouldn't say it was a bright visual feature for Shawn Atlas. In fact, I'll have to admit I didn't see much evidence of it visually when I was trying to observe.
Yeah, I never saw it visually either.
Yeah, so Shawn Atlas was a nice comet. I wouldn't call it a great comet. I know whether a comet's great or not really is kind of in the eye of the beholder. The comet did have to deal with a very bright moon for the week or 2 when it was at its brightest. But it was kind of cool to go out in the evening and see, 20 degrees of tail on a few nights. It wasn't a brilliant tail, but it was there. And it was definitely bright enough that I could bring my family out who are not astronomers, but they definitely saw it and noticed it. So I just kind of like Neowise a few years back. I wouldn't call it a great comet, but it was, the really good comet of 2024.
Yeah, I agree. Now, you brought up an interesting point with the light scattering. Magnitude estimates are always a interesting calculation when comet comes around. Now, is this something that is now in the equation, in the algorithm for calculating how bright a comet possibly could be?
It was always there.
Okay.
And like a lot of the greatest comets became bright because of this forward scattering by dust.
Right. Extra
enhancement of dust. Comets are really bright for really 3 reasons. One, they are intrinsically really big and bright. Think Hale-Bopp. Hale-Bopp was a monster. Or they came really, really close to us. Think Hyakutake.
Right.
But Hyakutake was also a nice bright comet, but really it coming within 0.1 AU is what created, made it a great comet. But a lot of the comets are really bright because they pass between the Earth and the sun. And so you had a few magnitudes of brightness enhancement.
Okay.
Like I mentioned before, if Shawn Atlas had not passed between the Earth and the sun and reached such a high phase angle, it would have peaked at second magnitude. It would not have reached -4. Mind you, that was -4, during the day. But even in the evening, we saw it eventually at about 0th magnitude. And we don't have to go very far back, about 20 years, to Comet McNaught, which reached magnitude -6. And that was a comet that was easy to see during the day. I mean, at least in binoculars. I didn't see it naked eye during the day, but easy during the day in binoculars. And that was a comet that had about 6 magnitudes of brightness enhancement due to forward scattering. On its own, it would have been 0th magnitude and no one would have seen it during the day. So a lot of those really spectacular comets are helped. And like I mentioned with Comet Halley, Halley has an orbit that quite often brings it either close to the Earth or between the Earth and the sun.
Right.
And if it wasn't for that, if Halley was on an orbit where instead of it going in the opposite direction from the Earth, it was kind of in the same direction of the Earth, So quite often it wouldn't pass between the Earth and the sun because we were kind of pacing each other.
Mm-hmm.
We probably wouldn't think of Halley as being anything special. It'd be like Pons Brooks.
Okay.
It would be, a nice comet every once in a while, but you wouldn't think of it as, Halley's like in the culture. It is the comet. When you think of, if you ask someone to name a comet, they will say Halley.
Yep.
Okay. But we did have one other interesting comet in 2024 that, what could have been. So, as Shawn Atlas was, still a naked eye object, but fading there at the end of September, we got news of a new sun grazer was discovered, C2024S1 Atlas.
Mm-hmm.
And it's rare for a sun grazing comet to be discovered before perihelion. And this comet was discovered a month before perihelion. And while not as bright as, Ikeya Seiki from, 1965, it appeared to be brighter than Lovejoy, the last bright sun grazer that was seen from the ground back in 2010, 2011. And so there was some real excitement that, we're going to have another naked eye, really bright daytime object. And maybe the Northern Hemisphere would have its first Kreutz sun grazing comet. Mm. This would be, kind of more of a November object with a big long tail in the morning sky. But alas, as it turns out, this object was only bright a month before perihelion because it was actively breaking up. It would probably had experienced an outburst, and it never really continued brightening. It was kind of bright, fade, outburst, and then completely fizzled and broke up as it rounded perihelion. So we're still waiting for a sun grazer.
Okay.
Yep. A bright sun grazer. Let's put it that way. There's always little Soho ones, but it'd be nice to have one. Have that searchlight beam tail that we all want to see.
There you go. So how does 2025 look?
So 2025 is looking to be kind of a down year. In fact, it's looking like we may be in the beginning of a few down years here. Now, that doesn't mean a brand new comet can't be discovered tonight that will turn out to be spectacular and bright months from now. But right now, there's not a lot going on. In fact, there's only 2 comets expected to arrive at perihelion in 2025 that are expected to be brighter than about magnitude 10.
Oh, my.
So there are 2 comets expected at perihelion in 2026 that will become brighter than magnitude 10 towards the end of 2025. So we'll start with the first one, which is actually magnitude 6 right now. And if you're going, wait, there's a 6 magnitude borderline naked eye comet right now. Why do I not know about this? Well, for one, you can only see it from the southern hemisphere. And even if you're in the southern hemisphere, it's only like a degree up at the start of astronomical twilight in the morning. So it's currently a horizon hugger. And this is a C2024 G3 Atlas.
Okay. Another Atlas.
Another Atlas. Yeah, Atlas has discovered over 90 comets right now.
Oh, my.
Which sounds like a lot, but that's still well behind Pan-STARRS and well behind the Catalina group when you add up all their discoveries with their various telescopes. And so C2024 G3 Atlas was discovered in early April 2024. And Atlas, which is the Asteroid Terrestrial Impact Last Alert System, is it's a system that came about after the Chelyabinsk impact to try to find asteroids in the last days to weeks before impact. It is the last alert system for objects that are maybe, meter, decameter, 100-meter size objects that might be inbound. And so they do a really good job of scanning the entire sky with telescopes. They've got telescopes in Hawaii, Chile, and South Africa. They discover, in addition to lots of asteroids, they're really good at finding comets. They're also really good at finding supernova. And this particular comet was found from their telescope in Chile. And at the time, it was 18th magnitude and about 5 AU from the sun. And it turns out that this object, when it was discovered, it was really, really far south. So this is an object that's approaching the sun from the south. And then when it recedes from the sun, it will also be going back down south. So this is going to be a southern hemisphere object. Okay. So this may not be visible from the northern hemisphere, but maybe. But we'll talk a little bit more about that later. So G3 here looks like it's dynamically old, which is good.
Mm-hmm.
Looks like it has been around before, though before being on the order of maybe 135,000 years ago. So that's a pretty long orbit. This object's going to get really close to the sun, about 0.09 AU. So that's, if you think, Mercury is about 0.3 AU. This is getting, a third of the distance that Mercury gets to the sun. And perihelion will be on January 13th. So this is coming up pretty quick. We're recording this the day after Christmas. So this is an object coming up pretty soon. Kind of like Shawn Atlas, this is an object that when it's at its brightest, it's going to be very close to the sun. In fact, it's going to be 5 degrees from the sun. It has been brightening at a nice clip, which has been good. A little better than 10 log R. If it continues brightening at that rate, and of course, that's always, the big assumption here, and we know about what making assumptions means. Mm-hmm. But let's assume it continues brightening at its current rate. That would mean it's peaking at a magnitude of about -5. Now, a -5 magnitude comet, 5 degrees from the sun, yeah, you're probably going to be able to people will be able to image that from the ground. Mm-hmm. And there might even be a few people that might be able to see that visually. But it's going to still be very, very tough because, again, you're only 5 degrees from the sun. Now, this is a comet that is really hugging the horizon. Like I said before, it's, even now, here in December, it's 6 magnitude, and it's only maybe a degree or two above the horizon before astronomical twilight starts. Mm-hmm. It's only going to get worse as it gets closer to the sun. At no point between now until probably a week after perihelion will you be able to see it against the dark sky. Oh. And that's only from the southern hemisphere. And that's really like by the time you get to like January 23rd, and by this time the comet will probably have faded to 3rd magnitude, will it rise, and by now it's in the evening sky, will it rise after the end of astronomical twilight? And say January 19th, it'll rise before the end of nautical twilight. Before the end of nautical twilight. By then it'll be 1st magnitude. But for the northern hemisphere, will we be able to see it? And the question here is maybe. Like I said, when it's -5th magnitude and 5 degrees from the sun, well-equipped folks with, if you're used to observing Mercury or Venus close to the sun, making observations of that sort, you might be able to see it, especially if you use a building or something to block out the sun. This is not an observation I would suggest for people who have never done this before. It is very, very easy. I've done it, I know, to accidentally have the sun point at the sun. Don't want to try it.
Right.
But will we be able to see it, say, in the morning or evening? And there is a possibility. So I guess the big question is, will we be able to see the comet, say, in the evening sky, in the morning sky before perihelion, or in the evening sky after perihelion from the northern hemisphere when the comet, it won't be as bright as it will be at perihelion, but it will be brightening. Kind of similar to like Shawn Atlas, where we were able to see it at about 0th magnitude before perihelion. Okay. And then 0th magnitude after perihelion as it was coming out in the evening sky. And so, say from New York City, so you're 40 degrees north latitude. As the comet's brightening, say January 8th or 9th, the morning of the 8th, 9th, 10th, the comet will rise about 50 minutes before the sun. Okay. That sounds like a lot, and you might be used to seeing Venus and Mercury rise 50 minutes before the sun, but that's still a really, really bright sky. But you are talking about a comet that at this point is about 0th magnitude. And luckily at this time, Mercury is in the sky at about 0th magnitude. or negative 0.5 magnitudes. So if you can find Mercury in the sky, and the comet won't be as high as Mercury, but at least if you can find Mercury in the sky, you might be able to use Mercury as a guide to find the comet a little bit lower.
Okay, that's a good clue.
Yeah, so that there's a possibility there.
Okay.
And that's morning sky in the days before perihelion.
Okay.
Then after perihelion, the comet, say on January 15th or 16th. So now it's the evening, January 15th or 16th. The comet will be setting about 40 minutes or so after the sun. But you are talking about a comet now that might be -2, -3 magnitudes. So again, this is something that naked eye, you're probably not going to see, but maybe in binoculars, definitely imaging. I'm always amazed when people, take pictures with just even DSLRs, and it's pretty obvious in the picture, but when you're looking through binoculars, you can't see it at all.
Right.
But it's obvious in the image.
Right.
So this is one of these comets where, in the olden days, I would have said no one's going to see it. But then, you go on skyweather.com, you're like, oh, wow, people are really seeing this thing. So I don't know. It's probably worth a try looking, again, like I said, in the morning, right before sunrise, a few days before perihelion, 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th. And then again in the evening, right after sunset, thinking more like, 13th, 14th, 15th, 16th, 17th. So it's very possible. Of course, this again is assuming the comet is brightening at the same rate it's brightening now, and it really does peak at -4, -5. If it kind of slows down even to just an 8 log R rate from 10 log R, it doesn't peak at -5, it peaks at -2. That changes everything.
Okay.
Yeah. And then for the Southern Hemisphere, it ends up kind of being like a Schuch and Shawn Atlas type deal where, got a first, second, third magnitude comet. Again, hugging the horizon, but with a nice tail. And yeah, they'll have a nice view of it as it slowly recedes from the sun.
Great. So you will be receiving observations from the Southern Hemisphere, definitely.
Definitely.
Good.
Yep.
And
so that's one definite comet, and that will probably be the brightest comet of 2025, unless something brighter is discovered. The only other comet coming to perihelion that is expected to be brighter than 10th magnitude is 2010 or 210 P. Christensen, which was discovered by Eric Christensen, Catalina Sky Survey back in 2003. One of the 25 comets that Eric Christensen discovered. This is a short period Jupiter family comet with about a 5.6-year rotation orbital period. It's after its discovery in 2003, it's been seen at every return since then, 2008, 2014. And its most recent return in 2020, it actually got up to about 10th or 11th magnitude. Kind of an interesting object because there have been 2 studies published that looked at its orbit that suggests that when we think of Jupiter family comets, we go, okay, these are objects that formed in the outer solar system. And as the outer planets all kind of moved around and migrated, these objects, these proto-comets, all got sequestered into the Kuiper Belt and spent the history of the solar system out there, and then got scattered back in by the major planets into the inner solar system. Well, it's looking like 210 P. Christensen is one of a handful of objects that might actually not have taken that route. It actually may be a object that originally spent most of the history of the solar system in the asteroid belt, and then ended up in the inner solar system. So this is possibly an object, and most likely from the Themis asteroid family. So this may be a little more akin to what we call main belt comets. As we know now that some of the comets, got thrown out into Oort clouds, some got sequestered in the Kuiper Belt, but some got trapped in the main belt. And so this might be an example of one of these main belt objects that now has been kicked into a cometary orbit, and so is now an active comet. So 210 P. Christensen, unfortunately, is not an easy observation. It's got a perihelion of 0.52 AU. That's pretty close to the sun. Its perihelion won't be till near the end of November of 2025. And so this is another object that's going to be close to the sun when it's at its brightest. In early November, as it's brightening past magnitude 10 to about magnitude 9, you'll only be able to see it in the southern hemisphere when it's an evening object. Then as it's passing through perihelion, it's going to be too close to the sun to be seen. At 8th magnitude, nobody's seeing that from the ground.
Mm-hmm.
And then as it's receding back out from the sun, we might have a chance to see it in the northern sky from the northern hemisphere now as a morning object. Now as it's fading from, magnitude 8.8 to maybe magnitude 9 for maybe a week or so at the end of November into early December. So this is a very quick object as it shoots around the sun, and it will be a horizon hugger from the southern hemisphere early November, and the horizon hugger from the northern hemisphere in late November, but only for a week or so. So not an easy object to see. And that is it for the objects that are coming to perihelion in 2025.
Okay.
But luckily, we do have 2 more objects that are coming to perihelion in early 2026 that will be bright at the end of 2025.
Okay.
So, and again, we have one Jupiter family comet and one long period comet.
Great.
So the Jupiter family comet is 24P show mass. This was a comet discovered in 1911 by Alexandre Chaumas from Nice, France. This was one of 3 comets that Chaumas discovered. It was a photographic discovery. 24P comes around every 8 years. And this is its 15th observed return since it was discovered. It was only missed at 3 returns since that 1911 discovery apparition. And the current return will be its 3rd best return that we've seen. Its best return was in 1952 when it passed 0.26 AU from the Earth and reached 6 magnitude. Some of our older listeners may remember observing it back in 1993. When it passed within 0.54 AU of the Earth and reached 8th magnitude. And this current return will be similar to that 1993 return, a little bit further out, 0.6 AU, but it should also reach about 8th magnitude between, 8.2, 8.3 magnitudes. So perihelion will be on January 8th, so, pretty close to the end of 2025. Perihelion's at 1.18 AU.
Okay.
And so in December, it'll be brightening. It'll be a morning object, observable from both hemispheres, so it'll be well placed for the north, up in the northern hemisphere. And it'll be breaking, magnitude 10 at the beginning of December. By the time we get to the end of December, at the end of the year, it'll be about magnitude 8.5. And eventually it'll go on to peak at around magnitude 8.2 during the middle of January, and should remain brighter than magnitude 9 through February and magnitude 10 through the end of February of 2026. So Chaumas will be a nice short period comet to observe next winter here, especially from the northern hemisphere.
All right.
And so the remaining comet that will be bright in 2025 is another one that won't come to perihelion until 2026. And this is long period comet C2024 E1 Vierchos. Vierchos is another Catalina Sky Survey discovery. This one was discovered by Casper Vierchos. This is one of 7 discoveries that Casper has made going back to 2020. He used the Mount Lemmon 1.5 meter to discover this comet in early March of 2024, back when the comet was 20th magnitude. This comet, we don't know if it's dynamically old or new. Right now, it's looking more like it's dynamically new, meaning it's making its first time around, but it's still a little bit of a question mark on that. The comet's going to come to perihelion on January 20th of 2026 at a perihelion of 0.57 AU, so it does get pretty close to the sun. Unfortunately, it never gets all that close to the Earth. Minimum distance to the Earth is 1.01 AU, and that's not till mid-February of 2026. Kind of similar to what we had with the 210P Christensen comet. This is another comet where when it's at its best, when it's at its closest to the sun, we actually are not going to be able to see it because it's going to be too close to the sun. In fact, it's going to be too close on the other side of the sun. So this is a comet where, as the year ends in 2025, we're going to see it as a low object in the evening sky from the northern hemisphere as it brightens from around ninth magnitude to maybe breaking into eighth magnitude in the beginning of December. And then it'll be too close to the sun to be seen. And then it doesn't show up again until near the end of January, where it might be a fifth magnitude object, but that's only for observers in the southern hemisphere. And by now it's an evening object. But it will eventually reappear in the northern hemisphere, but that won't be till the end of February, though it still should be a sixth magnitude object by then, but quickly fading. And then it should fade into, seventh, eighth, ninth magnitude as we get into March and April of 2026.
Okay.
Yeah, as I was mentioning, 2025 is a little bit of a slow year for comets.
Right.
And even looking forward, there's not a lot coming.
But as always, if a comet is discovered, we will get together and do different podcasts regarding those.
Yes. I mean, we do have a few that are coming, a few nice short period comets that are coming. 10P Temple, 22P Cop, 19P Borelli over the next, when we're talking 2026, 2027. All expected to have some of their best returns ever.
Okay.
In the case of Cop, reaching fifth magnitude. In the case of Borelli, reaching sixth magnitude.
Okay.
And yeah, at any time, there could be a brand new discovery.
Right.
And so hopefully there'll be something new to, be found and discovered as well.
Okay. Now, I have to ask you, 2024 seemed like, to me, the year of the smart telescope.
Yes.
You had the Sea-Star, you had the new Celestron Origin, you have the Dwarf. How have those telescopes affected comet observations you received?
So in 2024, we received almost 4,000 comet observations. And that's all kinds of observations, whether they were images, drawings, or magnitude measurements. And I'd have to say a sizable amount of those, probably about 10, 15% of those now are from smart telescopes. And not just images. There are observers out there now who are actually making, reducing photometry.
Yes. Yes.
I think smart telescopes are the future.
I agree.
I mean, when you think about it, all you're doing is you're automating the processes that you're doing anyway.
Right.
And you're doing them not so much that they're smarter, it's just you're automating it. And so as these telescopes become better, as they become easier to use, I mean, right now the telescopes are kind of geared more towards the beginning observers. But
what people are using them for is not beginning work anymore.
Exactly.
Yeah,
but as they start making these more and more geared towards people who are thinking more, I want to do photometry. I could see these being super powerful.
I agree.
And as they make them for larger and larger telescopes, I mean, right now these are very, very small telescopes,
right.
And I'm blown away by the results that are being produced with things that are, let's be honest, 30 millimeter apertures, 50 millimeter apertures.
I agree.
I mean, what's going to happen when someone puts this kind of AI automated capability, and hooks it up to an 8 inch?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think the Celestron Origin is a 6 inch.
Yeah.
So it's like this is, I mean, I love my Sea-Star. I think it's a great little telescope. And I made images of Comet A3 like I never could have done before.
Yes.
So I was wondering what kind of effect that you were seeing as a coordinator of the Comet section.
Yeah, we're definitely seeing it in images. We're getting a lot of images coming with people using EV scopes and mostly the Sea-Star S50. And there are people doing photometry as well.
Yeah. That's great.
Right now I've noticed they're not great for comets and that they don't always track on the comet. But that's an easy fix.
Yeah, there's software to do that.
Yeah, and at some point they're going to build that into the smart telescope itself.
Yep.
And once that day comes, then watch out.
I agree. I completely agree. Yeah, it's The times they are changing quickly.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. Well, Carl, this has been great. Again, this is one of my favorite podcasts of the year. You're always energetic, and your knowledge is amazing when it comes to comets.
Well, thank you.
Yeah. So if you have anything else, let me know.
Yeah, well, hopefully we'll have something new and exciting.
I hope so.
If not, I'll have 2025 to maybe catch up on some of my paper writing.
There you go. All right, Carl, I want to thank you for coming on the podcast today.
Yep. Thank you for having me, Tim.
All right. Well, that'll do it for this episode of the Observer's Notebook podcast. I want to thank Carl Hergenrother for coming on, and I want to wish everybody a very happy new year. We upload new episodes of the Observer's Notebook on the 1st and 15th of every month. You can subscribe to us on iTunes. If you do, please rate us and review us. I'd really appreciate it. You can also listen to us on Apple Radio, iHeartRadio, SoundCloud, Spreaker, Google Play, Stitcher, Amazon Echo, Spotify, and also on the ALPO YouTube channel. You can help support the podcast by donating to it via Patreon, where you can give up to $35 a month, where you'll receive 1 year's membership to the ALPO and producer credits on the podcast. And with that, I want to thank the producers of this podcast, Steve Siedentop and Michael Moyer, for their generous support. The link for Patreon, as well as the link for the ALPO, is in the show notes. You can contact me via email at cometman@cometman.net. Until next time, I hope that you always have clear and steady skies. Thanks for listening.